The Gun Violence Archive has now tracked 632 mass shootings so far this year in the United States. That's significantly more mass shootings than there have been days so far this year. ABC News Chief Justice Correspondent Pierre joins me now. Pierre, I do want to get your thoughts. We just got an update from authorities in Las Vegas on this shooting at UNLV. What do you make of the suspect's motive and what we saw play out there?
Well, we're still, gathering information, but it's clear that it may be tied, and I emphasize the word may be tied, to the fact that this man had sought employment at universities in Nevada and specifically UNLV. So authorities now can breathe a little easier, at least in Washington. It is not necessarily tied to any kind of massive terrorism plot or anything like that. But for those who lost their lives and who were injured, it's just as devastating. It's not a federal case in the sense of something that the FBI will have to take the lead on, but clearly an example of the tragic gun violence that we see playing out time and time again at every sector of American society. You can say shopping centers, you can say houses of worship, you can say movie theaters. It's happened everywhere.
Well, and I want to broaden our conversation out, Pierre, because you spent years reporting on gun violence and those innocent victims. You recently interviewed a 13-year-old girl, Alea, who was caught in the crossfire. This was for your special One Girl, One Bullet. You also spoke to her doctors. Let's take a listen to some of that piece.
Her heart stopped once en route, and they were able to perform CPR, give her medication, restarted it. When she got to the Atrium Cabarrus facility in the emergency department, her heart stopped again, and they had to perform emergency surgery on her chest to open it up.
What do you want to be able to do? Freely, without crutches?
Walk. That's what I've been wanting to do for the longest.
Says she just wants to walk. Pierre, what did you discover in telling Alea's story?
Well, a number of things about that story stood out to me. Number one, children being killed by gunfire is the leading cause of death of young people in this country. That's a recent phenomenon. And despite the fact that gun violence has actually gone down a bit in the last 2 years, it's stubborn when in regards to young people. And in fact, more young people are being shot and killed than was at the time of the Newtown massacre in Connecticut, when all those little children were killed at the elementary school. So this is an ongoing chronic plague that the country has, and even when it gets a little bit better, it's still horrible. And in telling that story, I think the main thing that came across to me is that I wanted to convey to viewers at home that when someone gets shot, it's not like something in the movies, that the people face weeks, if not months, if not years, of rehabilitation in many cases. In this particular case, she was home in the middle of the night in her own bedroom with her twin sister, and shots rang out. 30 bullets pierced the apartment that she lived in, and one hit her in the stomach, and there it remains. And to hear how this young lady had to struggle to survive, and how the bullet damaged her intestines, her colon, the artery that controls blood flow to her legs, and that even now she's still rehabbing and trying to get her life back to some semblance of normalcy, was really the point of that story.
It was such an excellent piece, Pierre, and I hope our viewers can all watch it. It's on Hulu from Nightline, and online on YouTube you can see it too. You know, the White House, I'm curious about what you see as a path forward here, Pierre, because we hear the White House again today calling for common sense gun reform. It's a call we hear time and time again after a mass shooting or after an attack like the one you talk about where there are those innocent victims. What do you see as any possible measure that could be common sense to help get to the root of this problem?
Well, I had a conversation with Congressman Maxwell Frost, who is the youngest member of Congress. And I think he perhaps summed it up very well when he said that, he's optimistic in the sense that there's an Office of Gun Violence Prevention in the White House, which is better coordinating federal efforts. But he said it's like watching paint dry, basically, in terms of meaningful gun control legislation being passed. We had modest gun control legislation passed shortly after the Uvalde massacre of all those children. But the issue of whether there should be universal background checks, a broader expansion of so-called red flag laws, things that have pretty broad support within the American public, still remain in a state of limbo. So again, there we are. And as I said to George Stephanopoulos on Sunday, at the end of the piece, I said, George, I can guarantee you in a few days we'll have word of another mass shooting, and then we have Las Vegas and what just happened in Texas as well.
Here we are. Pierre Thomas, thank you so much for your reporting and deep expertise on this.
Pleasure.
Let's bring the big story to our panel. Joining us today is ABC News contributor and SiriusXM radio host Mike Muse, ABC News contributor and former Republican Virginia Congresswoman Barbara Comstock, Democratic strategist and co-founder of Lift Our Voices Julie Roginski, and ABC News contributor and op-ed columnist for the Los Angeles Times, Elsie Granderson. Thank you all for being here. Elsie, I'm going to start with you because you have said that one problem to piggyback off what Pierre was just saying with solving the gun violence epidemic is that we dump many of these solutions at once into one bucket. What do you mean by that?
Well, unfortunately, I've been covering mass shootings, very much like Pierre for a long time as a journalist. And what's occurred to me through all my years of coverage is that you hear a lot of platitudes in terms of solutions being said by elected officials, like common sense gun laws. And you ask a very smart follow-up question, which is, what is an example of that, right? Like, how do we begin to construct solutions beyond just the platitudes? So I would suggest that instead of looking at what the American people want, because clearly elected officials aren't interested in that they look at what other elected officials want. And it seems to me that when it comes to the conversation of mass shootings, instead of looping in mass shootings with gang violence and gun violence and employee violence and et cetera, let's hone in on one particular form of violence and what it is attached to. Whether it's mass shooting, let's focus in on one. Regardless of the other shootings that get into the headlines, let's solve one particular kind of shooting before trying to move on to the next, as opposed to finding one bullet to solve all the problems, because that's not effective.
Well, Barbara, what do you make of that? Because we so often hear from the people who are making change in policy, from Republican lawmakers, thoughts and prayers, but very little push for action. Are there any areas, to get into those specifics, that there could be bipartisan support for?
Yeah, we did have the bill last year, but I think red flag laws are still something that you have in Republican states like Florida and Indiana and other Republican states that there is broad support for. I think there's some room for background checks. I'd like to see some kind of, presidential commission where you do bring, some very conservative Republicans and Democrats together and look at what has been done in these states, and then look at particular cases, of these shootings where what particular thing would have prevented this, these people from getting guns, because I think there are particular things in a lot of these cases where you can go back and say, okay, let's change that law, and there would be more agreement. But what we're doing isn't working, so we've got to come together and do more.
Julie, weigh in on that. And I'm struck also, as we're talking about the shooting at UNLV, this is not the first time we've seen horror in Las Vegas. There was the Mandalay Bay Resort shooting that left 58 people dead back in 2017. What do you think when it comes to any sort of solution so that we don't witness these horrors time and time again?
This isn't rocket science. We don't have more mental health issues in this country than other developed countries do. We don't have more people playing video games than people do in Western Europe, for example, but we are the only country where this kind of thing happens. And as Pierre mentioned, not just every day, but several times a day, these mass shootings that happen. And it is because of our policies. Let's be very clear. Republican states that have lax gun laws have higher rates of mass murder than states that have better and stronger policies to prevent that kind of thing. So again, we could sit here and talk about what kinds of laws, what can we do, but the truth of the matter is we already know the answer. We just have to enforce these laws and create new laws and make it stronger.
And Mike, I want to go to you. In the absence of action on that, how much do you think this day-to-day shootings are weighing on Americans. You know, do you think that this is something that people think about when they're going to concerts, when they're going to school? And what can the person at home feel like they can do about it?
That's a really great question. When Americans are going about their day-to-day activities, I don't necessarily think that gun violence is on the top of their mind as much as it is that there is possible threats that are out there. But I do think, Elizabeth, though, that those students who are in high school, middle school, and college, I do believe this is now a part of their conscious. I was with a family friend recently, and I was with the daughter, and they were talking to me about mass shooting drills that they do here in Manhattan. And I was triggered by that. So I think it's a part of the consciousness of our children more so than it is in adults. And I was thinking about this morning and looking at the data over 627 mass shootings, and I'm wondering if we've been looking at this wrong from a language perspective. Instead of using the word comprehensive gun reform, if we should just piecemeal it one small initiative at a time, because a narrative is out there of this idea that people are wanting to take away your guns. And so that is so embedded into the American psyche for individuals who are pro-guns and pro-Second Rights Amendment. I don't think that's going to change. But if we change the language to make it piecemeal and more incremental, over time, once individuals recognize that no one has knocked on their door yet, no one has come to remove your guns, then we can begin to subconsciously change from incremental to the actual macro level.
That's a great point, step by step.
If I may, Mike, I agree a lot with what you're saying, but I don't think at this point incremental is necessarily something that we should be aspiring to, considering this conversation really started in the 90s with Columbine. You know, it's not a recent conversation. So what exactly is incremental if we've been facing this problem for the last 3 to 4 decades?
Well, the last 3 or 4 decades, we've been saying comprehensive gun reform, but we're seeing this year we're at 627, the largest ever. So what we have been doing isn't working. So you can't keep doing the same thing without trying to find another alternative solution, because the macro level doesn't seem to be working as mass shootings are increasing at the highest levels that we've ever been. Michigan State students, you had students, Elizabeth, who said that they experienced a mass shooting in their high school and then also to experience it on their campus.
That word comprehensive, such a one that just speaks stalemate here in Washington a lot of the time. Guys, Mike, Barbara, Julian Elzy, thanks so much.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.